Hi, Seth.
Hi.
I just hear Sanders from Riga, and I'm very glad that you accepted and to give interview to me and to my blog. Maybe you can give us some few words about some introduction about you and as composer.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to talk with you, and I'm excited to just discuss some of these ideas that I've been thinking about. So, yeah, my name is Seth Shafer. I'm a composer and performer and a music technology researcher. My background is in performance. I, at one point in time, played a few number of instruments, including the tuba and keyboard instruments. Now I find myself composing primarily and doing research in the field of music technology. I am the assistant professor of music technology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where I coordinate a music technology program there. My compositional interests, as I'm sure we'll get into, tend to gravitate towards technology, although not exclusively. Yeah, so that's a little bit of an introduction to who I am. And I guess I can include too that I'm from Southern California. I grew up near LA and now live in Nebraska. So that's also quite a cultural shift. Found my way there via Texas, where I did some graduate work. And yeah, now I live in the Midwest and do my work there.
Yes, maybe you can just as composer, can you just give your criteria of good musical composition?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question. I work a lot with young musicians, and towards the end, I fully support the notion that you can learn something from any piece of music. And so when I think of a good musical composition, I think even if it's a terrible musical composition, you can always learn something from that, even if it's what not to do. Um, and as a professional musician, I'm exposed to a lot of music, and it may surprise non-musicians that uh, musicians can become potentially callous towards music. And this is our profession. We are exposed to it quite a bit. And so I wonder, about things that make something good. And what strikes me these days is music that surprises me. I
And
think
what do
that's
you? Uh,
I, yeah, I think when I'm listening to something and I reflect on it and think, wow, that was really a good musical composition. I think at some point the composer did something that I wasn't expecting that I think really worked. And that's a tough criteria. Like, what makes it really work? But I think it's, for me, it's something that makes me smile. And I think, yes, that was clever. That was unpredictable. They did something that I would not have done personally, and yet I wish I had. I wish that had been my instinct to do that, because that was the right decision. So I think ultimately I have to listen to that piece again, because I have to glean from that trick, that tool, that process, whatever it was that took me by surprise. And now I want to steal that, and I want to put it in my own toolbox and use it myself. So um, that's what I find these days, having listened to a lot of music.
and have you just maybe and you can you mention the piece which you surprised as the last one, the last surprising piece for you?
That's a good one. I can tell you about this is not a piece, and it's actually something that I put together. But I was pleasantly surprised by some student projects that I was working on.
Okay.
So I had asked students in a music technology course to analyze several different recordings of Michael Jackson song, and I was asking them to listen to the original version of it, comparing it to several remastered versions of this. And we were talking about the technical details. What does it mean to remaster something? Um, and in the process, a student had suggested that some of the timing between these different they're exactly the same piece of music, but some of the timing was a little different. So as a way to measure this, I overlapped all three of these pieces, these different iterations of the same recording on top of each other. And there it was, the timing was a little bit different. And of course, it's going to result in this nice phasing over the course of the whole piece as things slide into sync and out of sync. And it's just a very simple concept that's been exploited to death over the last 60 years. But it still puts a smile on my face at the surprising outcomes that happen, even in the realm of like popularly oriented music, that we can still, like, there's still these gems that will pop out of a song that we know inside and out, just as the result of throwing things against the wall and seeing what happens. So.
And what is your musical signature?
That's a tough one. I mean,
or I did this, or which one?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you two words that have been at the forefront of my compositional thought process for a number of years now, and that they're complementary. I think that they're this: it's ephemerality and multiplicity. So I'll explain the multiplicity part first. I am interested in creating works that can be played multiple times and have multiple versions of them. And so I think this stems from this idea that the live musical experience is really, that's ground zero. That's where music happens, is in the live realm. And I love going to see concerts where each performance is special, because as an audience member, you get to partake in something that no one else gets to ever again. And so creating works that every time they're performed, they must be different. There is some element that is changing. And at the same time, that ephemerality is complementary in the sense that that performance exists in that form just once and disappears. It's in the ear of the listener, and then it's gone. And I think the ephemerality part was a little bit, and continues to be a little bit, reactionary to the glut of documentation that composers and other artists are prone to do, to kind of make their work concrete and to get it out and to make it known among the community and among the public at large, which I do myself. But I guess I war against myself in that way, that I want to create works that are ephemeral and difficult to document, that are purposefully elusive in that way, that no single recording can capture the piece, because every time it's performed, it is different. So I think that kind of, those two words and those ideas continue to intrigue me when I think about music that I've written in the last 6 years or so.
Can you give me some example of your music piece which manifests this idea? Or
yes, so
thank you.
So several pieces that I've written in the last few years make use of technology in a way that allows me to give notation to the performer that changes during the moment of performance. There's a lot of terminology for this. I typically refer to this as real-time notation because it's changing in real time, but there's other terms that would describe this equally well. This is a proposition that is incredibly scary for the performers, potentially, because they're going to be asked to read the music for the first time in front of an audience. And so there's many factors that go into this. But one of the things that I want to create out of this situation is a trust between the performer and the composer that allows that performer to have the freedom to read as accurately as possible, but at the same time feel free to contribute collaboratively to the music, to make the music happen. And I certainly put a lot of trust in the performers to do that. And you're asking for some examples, and I have had several performances of a piece for violin or viola and computer. It's called Terraformation, that uses this exact real-time notation technology that displays notation to the performer while they're playing and actually reacts to what the performer is doing. And so the performer has some agency in what happens next in the piece. And I like to think of it as like forking paths, that the performer decides to choose to do this particular thing at this moment, and it leads to different outcomes later in the piece. And I have a piece that is right now, unfortunately, had a premiere that was canceled for piano and computer called Blue Sky Catastrophe. That's another example. And a piece that also was canceled in performance due to the COVID-19 outbreak called Polyterra 2 for flute, piano, and computer. Those would be some examples of that type of composition.
And what is your process of composing? How you start and how you evolve? And
yeah, well, I think, thinking about this, and I think about how I explain this to young composers as they're first getting started, and figuring out who they are as composers and what their workflow is and how they like to complete a composition. I typically, reflecting on this, I typically start with some sort of impetus. Why am I doing this, right? And I think as artists, we often ask ourselves that question, like, why do we continue to do this? What are we doing here? And for me recently, it's been collaboration. It's been contacts with amazing performers that want to work with me. And that has driven a lot of the beginnings of these pieces. And so I love the collaborations I've had recently, and I look for those as the Kickstarter to a new composition. But beyond that, I think the next step would really be collecting and building your instrument or your instruments, your sound sources, right? Those can be hardware, it could be software, it could be coding instruments. And then once you have your groups of instruments, you can start to look at those instruments critically, analyzing them and figuring out, well, how can they be played? What are they capable of? What are the limits? What are the special features of these instruments? And you should do the same with your performer as well, and think of, like, what does my performer like to play? What is like their sweet spot? What are they really good at? What challenges them? In what ways do they want to grow? You can take all of these questions and start to answer them, and then you get to what I think is the exciting part, which is organizing and conceptualizing all of these things that we've just thrown onto the paper, all of these answers that we have to our questions. Now we get to deal with the large scale concerns. We get to start working towards figuring out what the big idea of the piece is, and start working down towards those more local surface details. For me, another big concern is thinking about the use of space. And so many of my pieces have used multi-speaker spatializations if I'm using electronics, or placing performers in different locations in the space. So that's definitely something I consider. If I talk specifically about that real-time notation, one of the things I spend a great deal of time on is building mechanisms that compose like me. And so I will often do sketches to write out the figures that I want to occur, and then I permutate those figures and figure out, like, what are the variables in them. And then I start building that into a computer program, into an algorithm that can reproduce those results and also make new results that I hadn't imagined. And then ultimately, this process isn't complete until you bring it to your performers and you begin that back and forth, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, what do they want in the piece, how can they contribute to the piece, because ultimately I want them to contribute. I want them to own this piece. It's their piece. And so by the time we get to a performance, I hope that they have equally contributed to this piece, so that they can then present it with as much, hopefully, pride and excitement as I do. Yeah.
And how your like how your compositions and the way of composing change during last 10 years.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So, as I reflect back, 10 years ago was about the time that I started to experiment with electronics in composition. And so kind of reflecting on what's happened in the last 10 years and how have I changed. I think that in general, I'm much less concerned with notes. Much less concerned with what I mean by that is like surface level details.
Yes.
And thinking of pieces that I wrote 10 years ago, I was often focused on the small stuff, really like getting in there and nitty gritty details on almost like a per moment basis. And I've discovered that for myself, I actually enjoy composing big structural things. I'm much more interested in the structural experience. And so I tend to approach that first now and let the details of the surface, the moment by moment, be a little bit more emergent based on the larger scale structures. So I don't know if that's like a God complex or something that has kicked in, but
So
I find my
understand from details and microstructures to bigger like macro structures and
yeah, I just find that that's much more satisfying. And as a listener, I think that's what I take away from a listening experience is the large scale structure. If it strikes me as something that is well built on the big scale, I feel like that's a piece that then is worth looking into on those details. Uh, if I don't feel that way, then I don't care about the details. And so while I'm a little bit glib about saying that I'm not so concerned about the notes, I am, of course, but I don't consider those as the primary materials that we're walking away with. I think we need to think about the big things first, because I think those are the things that matter to me right now, anyway.
And I have some questions from other composers, but not particularly you, but to all composers.
Yeah.
And the first question is, what other composers want to ask to another composers is, why are you still composing?
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier that that's a question I ask myself constantly. There's many different mediums that are very attractive to me to work in. I love the visual medium. I've been, to be honest, I've been really obsessed with virtual reality recently. And yet I'm still convinced that sound is the best medium to represent my ideas. And I still come back to that ultimately. I'm still moved by sound and its ability to be as abstract as possible and as literal as possible. I feel like it has this incredibly wide breadth of experience. So for me, that's my medium, and I question it all the time. But so far, I'm sticking with it.
And the second question from composers, what what do you as composer fears the most?
Yeah, a lot of things. Maybe the most though, because it's such a vulnerable experience to collaborate with people. I feel like I'm most afraid that my collaborators won't like the experience. They won't like the music, that they'll be disappointed in the collaboration. I think that the collaborator is like my primary audience. And so I think that disappointing them is a great fear of mine. I've had several moments, where I feel like I've been on bated breath, where I've had the performer play through the piece, maybe the very first time, and I sit there extremely worried, just hoping that they say something like that was good. I enjoyed that. And there's been several moments that feel like I'm just on edge, like, oh, please, I hope that they like it. I hope that they like it. And so far, I've been really fortunate to have fantastic experiences with my performers and just really great collaborative experiences. And I trust that it's been similar for them as well. All signs indicate that it has. And I worry that at some point in time, it won't.
I see. And I'm very fond of technology as well, like you. And it's very interesting for me. It's always how technology shape some composers and their works, and how, like, can we say that technology and technological development somehow shaped your works as well?
Undeniably, yes. Um, one of the courses that I teach here at the University of Nebraska focuses on historical technology trends and their relationship to music, and it's just very clear that technology and music are working hand in hand constantly. And so many technologies have influenced my music. The computer as an instrument, that concept is hugely influential to me in the way that I've personally found I can extend my musicianship. That first, as young Seth Shafer playing piano, to later playing other instruments, tuba, etc. Extend that into the realm of computer coding and making the computer make musical compositional decisions has been a huge influence. Some technologies that have specifically played a very central role in my music include, like many composers, the Max coding platform. That's a visual graphical coding platform. And in particular, the extensions that allow notational generation and display, called the Bach project. It's Andre Agostini and Daniel Gysi. Their software has been hugely enabling to my particular real-time notation interests.
And have you experimented with sensors, virtual reality, or machine learning?
Yes, all of those. Machine learning in particular has been very helpful for the concept that I mentioned a little bit earlier about designing algorithms that can mimic the things that I would like to compose and then generate new material based on that. So having causal chains that can kind of unfold, or having learning algorithms that can take in a corpus and then generate new material. The project that I'm involved in right now is dealing with virtual reality, and in particular, sound representation in virtual spaces. And the technological backbone is a big, I did not invent any of that. I am riding on other people's tech coattails there, and trying to make new inroads there, but there's certainly a lot of technologies that I take and then use and try to repurpose for my own musical or research outcomes.
And if you would, what would be, let's say, your pick of free technologies? What will, I would say, shape the most music compositions in next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the next 10 years, so I'm trying to think of ways that it's not being as...
Historically, it was very, very important, right? Hardware and software, right?
Yeah.
So, like from hardware, it's starting from computers and laptops. Then nowadays, a lot of using sensors from softwares. When you can start creating, anybody can start creating electronical music. Max, of course, and then all different kind of multimedia softwares which supports, right?
Mm-hmm.
because without them we cannot even imagine, right? All this multimedia use.
Sure.
But what could be like next years, right?
Yeah, I mean, my hunch is to say virtual reality is a is the next frontier. And I'll put it this way, actually, I don't think, I think that new music will use it in that regard and will explore those frontiers. But I think the proof is already out there that this is an incredibly huge, exciting, burgeoning field. If you look at recent trends towards doing virtual concerts, for instance, especially in more popularly oriented music, the possibilities are endless and the audience is there. So whether it's virtual concerts or virtual reality concerts, I think that that's going to be a really big game changer in terms of popularly oriented live music consumption.
Yes.
And I guess I would say live in quotes there because it's virtual and often pre-recorded, and
Yes.
but the experience is very much live. And yeah, I don't think you have to look more than a few weeks back, and there's massive was it Travis Scott concert on Fortnite, just like really mind-blowing experiential things can happen in these virtual spaces. And I know people have been working on this project for decades now, but I think that we're at a point where the technology and its adoption by the general public it's nearing a tipping point where possibly, I don't want to predict this, but possibly virtual reality headsets will be much more commonplace, and these experiences by either solo artists or bands may come to they may be quite often. And
Yes. Yes. And this could be the case, right? Just it's my imagination now. That this COVID-19 even can facilitate, right? Both regarding adoption and in a way how people could use different kind of, let's say, technologies in order to make music not being closed, right?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, the numbers are incredible too. Like the numbers of people that show up to these virtual events are staggering, like millions of people. And the money that can be made in that is just undeniably huge. People buying physical commodities or virtual commodities. And so in terms of like commercially oriented, I think that it's an avalanche just starting right now.
Yes. And now we just look a little bit like 10 years forward. But if you would like in general, right, not only about technologies, if just what's to your mind, what is like, what things changed, or what looking 25 years back, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
How all the new music field
yeah.
evolved.
Yeah, that's a good one. I should tell you that I've only really been familiar with contemporary concerns since about 2003-ish. So, about 20 years ago, my perspective was narrow, but I was at least paying attention to some things. And kind of thinking of what I've witnessed in the last few years and trying to extrapolate to what might be coming down in the future. I've noticed in the last few years that there's a real trend towards original instruments, original sound production. Certainly, there's a trend that's been going way longer than that. Is that Lackaman-esque approach to new ways of playing familiar instruments, but I really see in many, many composers a search for novel timbres, novel sounds, and I think that's a really exciting perspective, and I'm seeing a more wide adoption by performers as well. And
Sorry, just
no problem.
my good son.
No problem. And I guess looking forward to like future trends, I mean, I wouldn't claim to know, and like thinking about, for instance, like our community that we have as this, I would say it's a small community of new music practitioners and audience members. I can only hope that we can, as that community, broaden the number and the nature of the voices that have the privilege to contribute to the discussion. I think that there's some really great trends, but I'm thinking specifically of composers whose voices have been historically ignored or minimized, and I really hope that they will continue this trend of being more championed and of an equitable representation, and feel like they're equal partners in this community. So in terms of kind of broad community-oriented trends, that's one of the hopes that I have. And I hope that they get to have a lot of shaping power over that.
And maybe how you see how like audience of new music change last 20.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the new music audience has always been small, at least in the United States. I think that one thing I've seen change is maybe an awareness of the role of technology in performance. Definitely seen changes in the audience. So as an example, an early piece of mine that used technology was for trombone and very simple delay. So the trombone plays a note and then it's delayed a moment later. Obviously nothing new at that time, really low tech, but the audience was really quite stunned by this illusion of having multiple sounds from a single performer. Now I think audiences are way more savvy when they see a microphone on stage, and I would attribute this to maybe a familiarity in popular music. General knowledge of instruments still strikes me that the person pulled from the sidewalk would know a particular electronic instrument, like an 808 drum machine, or referenced an 808 kick. Like that surprises me. They would know instruments like that, or they'd be familiar with techniques like sampling. So that's just kind of common knowledge now, or processes like looping. So I think that there's an increase in the kind of the knowledge of technology coupled in performance and live performance. So yeah, that's maybe some trends that I've seen in audiences. I still think it's small, but I think they're a lot more aware of technology and performance.
And and how you see what's the role of new music, right, in society? Because for example, in Europe, it's quite heavily much subsidized, right, by governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the role in society, I truly have no way of knowing. I can only hope that our community's efforts are impactful on some sort of larger scale. But within the community, it's hard to see. I would say it seems to me that the role of contemporary art in society generally, at least in the US, is always precariously near the periphery of public attention and government funding. It's a scary place to be. But at the same time, I think it seems that art maybe should occupy that fringe area. That to have this maybe like outsider perspective or outsider power, almost prophetic, a voice in the wilderness, maybe a warning or maybe an invitation. I don't know to what or about what, but I think that maybe depends on every artist, is to hold up their sign from that outside and to point it at the public and ask them, or to tell them. I mean, maybe it's a better way to think or a better way to interact or relate. I don't know, but I think maybe that periphery, that fringe, is the place that new music has in society.
And the last question, how you see, and particularly going back to technologies, how you see how this how artificial intelligence technologies evolve and are adopted and in the context of new music.
Yeah,
Because
so
everywhere around, like we see, there's a lot of, let's say, talks and a lot of projects which redefine almost like a lot of different kind of areas of life and work, right? And how this uh, how this will shape new music. So
yeah, I mean, this is artificial intelligence or the machine being an artist, basically, has a huge history going way back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I think that for me, I embrace it. I love it. I love this kind of questioning who is the artist. For me personally, that question shouldn't be answered. It's this kind of ephemeral experience. Creation is something that happens in a democratized way, perhaps delegating some of the creative um, decision making to the machine. I love that. Uh, I embrace that, and I think that there's many people that do. I see that there is maybe there's many trends in this regard. I mean, certainly like David Cope's work with artificial intelligence and almost to a degree of mimicry of trying to digest and then regurgitate the properties that make up, a Beethoven piano sonata, right? I think that's incredibly interesting. That's not my personal interest. I like trying to figure out ways to surprise myself um, through asking the computer to adopt some of the principles that I hold close to me as a composer and suggest uh, new paths. And so I find that it's a symbiotic relationship for me to be able to delegate some decision power to the computer and then to accept that outcome. And in many ways, it is analogous to a collaboration. And so I feel that artificial intelligence or pseudo artificial intelligence is how I typically think of it in my music. I'm certainly not using any high grade AI in my music. I adopt that collaboration wholeheartedly.
thank you very much, Seth, for interview, and thank you very much.